Hi, everyone. My name is Scott Morrison. I'm the Vice President of Industry Solutions at Everbridge, and I'm excited to introduce our speakers today, Michael Collar, Director of Industry Solutions at Everbridge, as well as our special guest speaker, Kel Udiala, Industry Analyst at the research firm Verdantix. Kel's current agenda focuses on EHS, industrial hygiene and occupational health software. He has a background in oil and gas, renewable energy, waste management, and recycling. Michael is Director of CEM Business Solutions at Everbridge, where he helps empower sales leaders and customers alike with data-driven business insights. It's our pleasure to welcome you today to our session. Mitigating Employee and Business Risk for EHS Regulations. We'll explore valuable techniques, examples, and best practices for overcoming EHS challenges, how COVID has changed the EHS landscape, insights to achieve enhanced operational excellence, and some additional insights. So before we begin, I have a couple of housekeeping items. We will be recording the session and making it available to everyone who's registered. Also, we'll be taking audience questions, and we'll try to get to a few of those at the end of the session. So please feel free to submit those questions through the panel there. And if we're not able to get to your questions, then we'll be sure to have someone follow up with you directly to answer that. So without further ado, let's jump into the session. And Kel, I'm going to direct the first question towards you. For those on the call who aren't as familiar with EHS, can you please explain what that is and why it's important for business leaders to be knowledgeable about it?
Thanks, Scott. Well, diving right into the question, I would say EHS, which is an acronym for Environment, Health, and Safety, is all about keeping all stakeholders safe and healthy. And by stakeholders, I'm of course referring to everyone, including the employee and the public. Essentially, everyone the employer's operations might affect directly or indirectly. For EHS, environmental protection is in the context of compliance requirements that ensure the environment as we know it remains unharmed. The safety aspect is in the context of regulations to ensure the employee and the public are unharmed. And finally, the health aspect covers the well-being of all stakeholders. And well-being includes physical well-being as well as mental well-being. And EHS requirements do not end in the workplace. The concept encourages the well-being of the employees even when they leave the workplace in their for their commute home. Thanks.
Yep, great. So just as a follow-on, what are some of the critical occupational and environmental health and safety management challenges that businesses are facing, and what do you see as possible solutions to overcoming some of those challenges?
So in the past, the EHS function was perceived as a cost center and would usually be the last function to receive much needed funding. But because of advanced analytics solutions, decision makers are connecting the dots and seeing the positive impact of the EHS function on the bottom line. This could be in the form of, medical costs or fines avoided. So another challenge is the lack of cross-functional collaboration, although technology providers are tackling this issue. For instance, when business functions work in silos and cannot share data efficiently, the business incurs what I would call an opportunity cost. For example, some EHS insights about, say, a high-risk activity or a high-risk area may not be readily available to the operations team. And as a result, efficiency improvements may take time, and any cost savings associated with such improvements could be delayed. In terms of solutions, one such solution is the implementation of a fully connected ecosystem for the sharing of information across business functions. As an example, the use of advanced analytics and AI, which would enable decision makers to glean insights from what I would say call statistically correlated events that maybe an ordinary person may miss. So in terms of solutions, I would say robust analytics and greater connectivity between business functions is a good solution to these challenges. And the connectivity would arise from implementing a unified platform with connections to sensors and IoT devices.
Okay, excellent. So as a follow-on to that, Mike, as a leader in the critical event management space, could you maybe talk about and explain how CEM technologies can address some of the challenges that Cal presented and maybe part of those solutions?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Scott. Before diving into the technologies, let's first understand what a critical event is. So a critical event is really whenever a bad event is or could be affecting something that your business cares about, whether that's the safety and security of your people, visitors, suppliers, partners, things like that, or even more nebulous concepts like the brand and things like that. So critical event management is really about adopting solutions and processes and workflows that mitigate the impact of those critical events when they happen through robust preparation, efficient management, and following up in an after action sense to learn and improve on those processes. So at Everbridge, we like to think about critical event management in 4 steps. The first is assess, where we're actually detecting the signals, detecting the threats, contextualizing the threats that might be impacting our business or the safety of our people. The second is locate, where we're actually doing that correlation that I talked about, a bad event correlating to something that we care about, locating all of our stakeholders, our facilities, our brand, and understanding if there is a correlation to this bad event. And if there is, we move on to the act stage, where we're really mitigating the impact of that critical event on the business and on our people themselves. That takes the form of messaging, crisis management, things like that. Organizing that response, the steps that you go through as a business leader to mitigate the impact of that critical event on your business and your people. And then the final step is to analyze, like Kel said earlier, to understand how you perform as part of that critical event management and where you can improve in the future. So when it comes to technologies, technologies help in particular, to Kel's point about silos. Technology helps to centralize the critical event management process so that you can move from stage 1 to stage 2, et cetera, efficiently and effectively. And it also helps on the analytics side of things to really understand, what we did well and what we could do better through robust auditing and things like that. So when we talk about a robust critical event management technology, we're thinking about technology that helps move through these steps of the critical event management process as quickly and efficiently as possible, while keeping stakeholders informed and allowing you to analyze the performance. All of that will help with mitigating the overall impact of the critical event on the business itself and the people.
So Michael, you and Cal both referred to silos, and you briefly kind of touched on the fact that critical event management technologies help eliminate these silos. Can you go in a little bit more detail about that? Like, how does that happen? Because it seems to me there's still a lot of different tech systems and connections and all this data involved. So how does CEM technologies actually help eliminate those silos?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different types of silos that's worth noting. There are kind of internal functional silos and there are cross-functional silos, like Kel mentioned earlier. So kind of the internal silos within a particular function refer to different teams kind of working on different islands, so to speak. So there could be within critical event kind of the primary stakeholders involved in a critical event, for example, could involve multiple teams. You could have a security team, you could have a business continuity team, a supply chain team, a logistics team, crisis management team, et cetera, all within kind of this, this critical event management bubble, so to speak. All of those teams could be using separate tools with separate processes and not communicate with one another very effectively, right? So that's one type of silo. The second type is the more cross-functional type of silo, where different parts of the business, like human resources or business development, or external type of departments are operating themselves in their own silos with the same kind of cross-functional issues that you might experience internally. So what technology allows you to do is to one, establish what we call a single pane of glass that can serve as that unified common operating picture that Cal mentioned earlier, where all of the connections flow in and there's a single source of truth, so to speak, when it comes to critical events and possible critical events. It also allows the cross-functional communication through that unified platform, but also through automation and orchestration, where specific acts are automatically generated and workflows are undertaken automatically based on the characteristics of that particular critical event. And using that, you can really string in all different parts of the business that need to be involved in or stay informed by the response to that critical event. And that really gets you through that critical event to the mitigating procedures and ultimately overcoming that critical event more efficiently, more quickly, in a way that will keep your people safer.
Great. Thanks, Michael.
Mm-hmm.
Cal, in your recently published report about EHS and CEM, you talk about how CEM solutions can help companies manage and respond effectively to unforeseen events, ensuring resilience and ultimately saving lives. Could you give us an example of a real-time event that might illustrate this?
Well, an example that springs to mind is the explosion in Beirut, Lebanon, which occurred middle of last year, 2020. So the explosion inflicted an estimated, I think, $15 billion worth of property damage, and that rendered about 300,000 people homeless. So the relief efforts in response to this, they were really stretched. I think they required about 70 ambulances and more than 370 medics immediately after the explosion. So CEM solutions can facilitate relief efforts, especially by IT network infrastructure, which connects individuals, firms, emergency services, as we alluded to earlier, eliminating silos. So this connectivity can help direct medics and firefighters and send out information and confirm the safety of individuals who respond to the alerts. And I'd say emergency services did use CEM solutions during this disaster. And another example that comes to mind is more of a personal one. So I used to work for one of the largest recycling facilities this side of Europe. So we during my time there, we implemented a fire response technique, and it was a whole connected ecosystem, a platform that consisted of infrared cameras, machine learning algorithms, sensors, all connected to a command center in Germany, but also connected to the facilities system, alarm systems and emergency response systems. So while I was there, it once kicked in, dousing several thousand tons of recyclate with chemical fire retardant, but ultimately saving it from incineration brought about by a lithium ion battery. So these are two examples, real life examples that come to mind. One is essentially a national disaster, which we all heard about, and the other is more closely related to my personal experience in industry. Thanks.
Wow. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Cal. Michael, I know you work with customers as well. Any additional examples you might have?
Yeah, I think a really good example is the example of kind of the active assailant or the potential active assailant in the vicinity of a particular facility. And what we hear from customers is the desire to have both external situational awareness and internal situational awareness within that single pane of glass, within that common operating picture. So what I mean by that is, external situational awareness could be signals from social media, or direct signals from media, from intelligence analysts, et cetera, reporting on a potential, security event happening in the vicinity of a particular facility. Emergency management chatter as well, the first responders, things like that. Correlate that with internal signals. So, do we have doors ajar, for example? Do we have, forced entry detection or glass break detection? Things like that. Looking at our cameras on site to see, are there any unauthorized folks or suspicious people on the campus, for example? Being able to do all that in the assess phase, and then if there is a potential threat, being able to correlate the specific people that are on site. So bringing in not only kind of employee or HR information systems on what employees might be working, but also integrating with visitor logs, badging, and things like that to understand who is on site and who could be affected. And then moving into that act phase, we're actually going to mitigate the impact of that by deploying security resources, informing emergency personnel, et cetera. So I think that's a really good example of technology bringing everything together, and we hear customers doing this all the time. Thankfully, in most cases, they're false alarms or there's no actual on-site threat. But there are cases where we've had our customers tell us about actual security events happening on site, and being able to deploy these resources in order to mitigate the associated threat and keep their people safe.
Got it. Thank you. Thanks. Cal, in your opinion, how has COVID highlighted the need for having safety and preparedness plans in place so that businesses can be more proactive rather than reactive when a critical event strikes or happens?
So pre-COVID, the typical business continuity plans depended mainly on industry vertical and geographical location, mostly responding to natural disasters, having plans for those. But during and post-pandemic, firms are now including firm-wide sickness to that list because of the effects of COVID. So the EHS function has often focused on the E for environment, which may include leaks and spills, and also the S for incident and accident management, the S standing for safety. So now there's a greater emphasis on the H for health. So activities that were previously seen as tick box exercises suddenly became really important. For example, firms, had to pay close attention to their PPE supply chain in the wake of the N95 mask shortage when COVID started. So firms bolstered their pandemic response plans, as well as the underlying and supporting IT infrastructure in order to accommodate several, direct and indirect effects of the pandemic. One of them, being remote work. So I would say now firms are thinking, how do we prepare for the next one? So firms are actively incorporating lessons learned from this pandemic, and tech providers alike are also working to provide the necessary tools. So at the start of the pandemic was pretty much very reactive, but because we've learned a lot since then, we've seen firms in the market landscape implement technologies and processes that would also aid them were this to happen again. So essentially, firms are becoming more proactive.
Excellent. Thanks, Cal. Mike, same question to you. Have you, seen, a heightened need for having these plans in place, or maybe even updating them more frequently? What have you seen in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, COVID has really been, the critical event of our generation, potentially, if you look at global impact. And it's been an acid test for the entire world and all businesses around the globe. Everybody's had to respond to COVID in some way, shape, or form. To Kel's point, most organizations reacted reactively to COVID because they didn't have the proactive plans kind of set up. So those that could either react more quickly or were proactive with their their health guidelines and the protocols associated with the potential disease outbreak, were better positioned to, one, keep their employees safe and their partners safe and the actual people safe, reducing the likelihood of contracting COVID by removing, having, okay, this is our protocols. We remove people from the office that can, those that can't, we have guidelines in place to try to keep them as safe as possible. But also there's a business side of that, business impact of that as well, is being able to, instantly or near instantly initiate those protocols. The companies that reacted more quickly were able to get back to, productivity, or, what is close to 100% productivity more quickly. So there's a business case as well as kind of a safety case for this as well. So I think we've all learned from COVID, and we all know now, if you look back at SARS and MERS and things like that, see similar, outbreaks that occurred. This is not going away. It might not be quite as expansive, when the next one happens in 5 or 10 years. But this is all something that companies need to prepare for, not only for a business continuity sense, but also for employee health, and having those plans prepared and digitized, so that you can switch to that remote state as quickly as possible, as efficiently as possible, and as safely as possible, is going to be important going forward.
Great, thanks, Michael. Yeah, and just to kind of add commentary to that, in the companies that I've spoken with that did have pandemic plans, none of them that I spoke to, any of those plans consider the duration that we were dealing with. So they may have had a pandemic plan, but maybe the anticipation was it would be something where they'd have to, make adjustments for maybe a month or 2 months or 3 months at most, but nothing to the duration that we've seen with COVID-19. So given that, since the spring of 2020, EHS has been centered a lot around COVID-19. That's been a huge kind of focal point. These changes, like strict hygiene regulations, prolonged remote working, all have presented new challenges, and look like, as you said, they're going to continue, to demand attention this year at least, and potentially even, into the future. So, Cal, how has the industry adapted to kind of this changing landscape that we've now seen with COVID-19?
So I'd say that the industry adapted first by realizing the EHS function is not just a cost center, and secondly, increasing funding as a result of this realization. So one of the research that Verdantix carried out was titled a Global Corporate Survey, and we spoke to about 301 participants spread across 35 industries and 25 countries. So one thing we noticed for sure was the influx of funding into the EHS function. So these were mainly because the increase in funding was mainly because the EHS function typically spearheaded many pandemic response plans from the perspective of the industry stakeholders that we spoke to, and this is because obviously such things fall within the remit of the EHS function. So what we saw was literally an explosion of activity from EHS tech providers offering solutions for pandemic response, remote work, and connected worker systems, especially relating to social distancing through using, say, proximity sensors or geofencing. And the EHS function actually got the funding needed to implement these technologies. So it was essentially a life or death situation for a lot of firms where they had to essentially, if I could use it in loose terms, cough up the money or face direct consequences later on. So they had to spend the money in order to continue some semblance of their prior pre-COVID operations. So to summarize, I would say the industry adapted by realizing how valuable the EHS function is, and then this essentially equated to greater funding into the function. Thanks.
Okay. And so with all of these new developments, these new technologies and measures that have emerged as a result of this, which ones do you see as being part of the new normal going forward? Do you see most of them kind of staying or not? So what are kind of your view of what it'll look like now in the new normal?
Okay, there are a few technologies that will be part of the new normal, and there are a few that I believe would return to normal. So will return to their pre-COVID states. So going forward, we're likely to see a lot more remote working solutions persist. If not because of a cultural shift in the way we work, then it will be because of ESG pressures to reduce Scope 3 emissions. So you get a situation where you get more remote auditing, and you get more remote content delivery. So decision makers will pay more attention also to their supply chain, both in memory of the pandemic because of the shortage of PPE, and also I'd say also due to ESG pressures. So another technology that is up and coming and is being steadily adopted is the use of AR and VR. So this will likely increase for training purposes, so that trainees and trainers do not necessarily have to be in the same place. And like I mentioned, remote content delivery, this is a tech that is very suitable for remote content delivery for training purposes as well. And one area that we saw a significant interest in is the use of mental health and well-being solutions, and this is not surprising given that the pandemic, how it changed the dynamics of work and even people worrying about their physical health and those of loved ones. So this placed a lot of psychological stress, and this, I mean, in a couple of years, that's when we'll probably see the true extent of the mental health toll that the pandemic has taken on people. So we've seen a huge interest in the market for mental health and well-being solutions. So this is one of the biggest ones that we'll see be part of the new normal. As I mentioned before, the pandemic has made decision makers focus more on the H for health in EHS. Thanks.
Thanks, Cal. So as part of this new normal, you mentioned businesses shifting to more of a hybrid workforce, a lot more remote workers. So Michael, how has digital transformation changed the way that leaders need to be thinking about safety and security of their people and their operations? And have you seen digital transformation initiatives accelerate through as a result of the pandemic?
Yeah, yes, to both of those questions. So starting with the first, I'd like to just second, Kel's sentiment that, when we talk about safety and security, we can think about well-being as well as part of that kind of EHS umbrella, and how that's really changed compared to a couple of years ago. And that includes the element of connectivity, helping employees feel connected to help with their mental well-being, and their the services kind of technology that helps employees feel more connected or checking on employees a little bit more often are going to be very important going forward. I guess within the perspective of the more traditional kind of safety and security, what's changed is one, the exposure associated with the risk of companies, with employees working remote, hybrid, the decentralization of the office, moving maybe to more satellite offices in suburbs or exurbs. That changes the risk profile of an organization that more traditionally was centralized around that kind of business hub, in a central business district, for example. So you're seeing much more distributed risk, right? Where instead of needing to prepare for, guard one facility or a few number of facilities against, safety and security threats, you now have a much more distributed risk and a much higher likelihood that some sort of critical events are going to be impacting your employees at a given time. Now, it's probably not going to be as severe as the ones that you traditionally prepared for in that kind of centralized central business district, for example. But that it's going to be much more frequent for employees to be experiencing severe weather, for example, and having to prepare for and respond to those types of threats affecting your people now that they're more distributed. In terms of reacting and preparing for these critical events, this is really, this type of thinking has stuck around much longer than I think it should have. But the old ways of doing things with paper binders and people in-person coordinating responses and things like that, the pandemic has really displayed how inefficient that is now and how vulnerable that type of system is. So that really reinforces the need to move to a more digital type of critical event management space. Now those things that previously had been just possible inefficiencies, relying on a paper binder for your standard operating procedures, or having to call somebody from down the hall to help organize a response to a critical event. Those that were previous just kind of inefficiencies and just kind of annoyances are now critical threats to a business that need to respond in a more digitized, decentralized way.
Great, thanks, Michael. Yeah, I know in conversations that I've had with both the security functions and the HR functions, one of the comment that I often hear is that as a result of COVID, it's really redefined what duty of care means for employers. And oftentimes duty of care for some, it changes by region of the world and by vertical, but for some organizations, as you mentioned, Michael, it really kind of only extended to when you're at my location, my office, and that organizations have had to rethink duty of care because not only are there new challenges with life safety, but that also then kind of presents challenges to business operations and business resiliency when you're trying to when your employees are not within the confines of your four walls, for example.
Yeah, and Cal, you did a good job of mentioning that that's now kind of more embedded within the EHS doctrine, right? And we're not, we're moving away from a state where everybody is all the time punching in and out of a central office, and then that's where duty of care could end. Now with folks, a lot more folks working remotely, there is no punch in, punch out. There's no, now I'm at work and now I'm not. There's a kind of, it's a much more malleable experience for employees, which I think reinforces the need to that Cal mentioned earlier, which is, the EHS umbrella really needs to expand to include, these remote workers in a 24/7 sense.
Yeah. And just to add to that, during the height of the pandemic, we saw from research data that a lot of firms were implementing ergonomics software, and you can essentially see that this was aimed at their employees who are working from home, because as you know, the home environment, not everyone would have like the perfect workstation at home. So that duty of care extended to the home, whereby firms were actually getting their remote workers to, do self-assessments for ergonomics to make sure that they prevent any future possibility of, say, musculoskeletal disorders from remote working.
Interesting. Wow. Fascinating. So one last question for you, Cal. Michael referred to, or you talked about digital transformation earlier. So how does the EHS function stand to benefit from this shift to digital? And what technologies are they adopting, or organizations adopting the EHS function to help fortify resilience now, but also beyond COVID-19? And you touched on some of those earlier, but maybe just expand a little bit about those technologies and how they help fortify resilience.
Okay, so I would say moving to digital will allow for more collaboration between teams and also functions. So, and another thing I mentioned before was, statistically important trends that the ordinary eye may not, see. So decision makers can glean greater insight how each operation works synergistically through a more connected ecosystem. And the use of analytics will ensure that decision makers can pick up on these statistically important trends that could easily be missed. And so with respect to that, I would say the use of analytics and AI, it's growing, and it's also yielding benefits because it's directly impacting the decisions that are being made. And talking about some of the other technologies firms are adopting to fortify resilience, they include, as I also mentioned, remote productivity tools for remote working, remote auditing, remote content delivery. Just as an example, during the height of the pandemic, where everyone was just about getting to work from home, if you looked at the stock market, you would see that what I would term remote work stocks were essentially increasing a lot in value, and these were your Slacks and your Zooms, and even entertainment stocks like Netflix, because a lot more people are working from home, right? So this essentially is a signal as to what's coming as our work culture changes, and we become more of a hybrid. We go into this hybrid working environment where some work from home and others work from the office. Another area is supply chain optimization solutions. As I mentioned earlier, not only because of the lessons learned from PPE shortage, but the increasing awareness of ESG as well. And just as I mentioned before also, well-being solutions, especially in tackling the mental strain brought about by the pandemic. And yeah, in terms of a connected worker ecosystem, I know the word connected can remove the humanity out of it, but essentially I would use the word engaged much more than connected, because you need the connection needs to be meaningful. As much as giving information to the worker in the field, you also need to get information from them, but that information doesn't always have to be data regarding work processes. It could be, as I mentioned before, their psychological state, if they're fit to essentially be in the field, and also if they have any psychological or environmental stressors that could affect them because of that duty of care. So these are the technologies that I would see firms adopting or implementing more of to fortify their resilience beyond COVID-19. And just as an addition, firms are also implementing mass vaccination programs, and I see this going beyond just COVID-19. Just taking the yearly flu jab, for instance, the solutions that were available to facilitate this, I would say we're lacking, especially in the underlying IT infrastructure that supported them. But because of COVID-19, firms are essentially well, I would say shoring up this IT infrastructure, making sure it's state of the art, and even tech providers are essentially providing new solutions that will not only be used for COVID-19, but will be used for other vaccination programs going forward.
Wow, fascinating. Very interesting. We're a little over on our time, gentlemen, but any last thoughts from either of you or pieces of advice for our audience before we close out?
Yeah, I'd like just a piece of advice would be, we've heard today about how COVID has changed the landscape and how the nature of duty of care, the nature of EHS is changing. My piece of advice is don't let COVID pass without making major changes to your organization. It's presented both the need to digitize and to centralize your critical event management and your EHS functions. It's also, as Cal mentioned, provided a bit of an opportunity, right? It's not only that this happened and it would have been nice if we had a system. It's going to happen again to some extent. There's going to be another disease outbreak. These are not going away. They're only becoming more frequent and more significant. Use the opportunity and the learnings of COVID to change the way you handle EHS at your organizations and you handle critical events at your organizations. Because if you don't, I guarantee your competition is, and you're going to be falling behind if you don't.
Yeah, my final thoughts echo, Mike's sentiment as well. I can't overstate the importance of the EHS function. So during and in the wake of the pandemic, the EHS function proved that it brings a lot of value to firms. But given how fast-paced life can get, I would recommend we all remember this so we don't return to our old ways. For instance, we've had several flu pandemics before, but it shouldn't have to take a couple of them for society to pay attention again like it did during the one in 1918. So I would say pay attention. We should all remember the value of the EHS function during this time. And we have to look forward and be more open to technologies like CEM and connected worker ecosystems and the immense value that it adds to our business.
Great, thanks, Cal. I guess to echo what you just said, at the very beginning in your opening remarks, you said, you mentioned the fact that, EHS, used to be viewed as a cost center, but now we're seeing that it really provides a lot of value to the organization and shouldn't be viewed that way. So I think that's a big takeaway, the value of the EHS function. And then, Michael, as you said, use COVID-19 as an opportunity to, to leverage digital transformation and make some of the improvements that maybe, you wouldn't have made, if this event hadn't occurred. So while a bad event, certainly it can also be an opportunity for positive change, and we can learn from that. So thank you both, gentlemen, for your thoughts and insights today. Because we were not able to get to any of the questions, we will, for anyone that did submit a question, we will make sure that that someone follows up with you on that question. Also, just a reminder that the session is being recorded, so look out for an email with the link so that you can watch the session again on demand. If you want to learn more about how CEM can help solve some of these EHS challenges that we talked about today, you can download the recent Verdantix report, Critical Event Management for EHS and Risk Management. And we'll also send out the session slides from today, which will include a link to download that report. So with that, I really want to give a big thanks to our speakers, to Cal Udiala and Michael Collar. Thank you again for your insights and for joining and taking time out of your busy day. And we look forward to seeing you at future sessions. So thanks, everyone, and have a great and safe day.
Thank you.
Thanks.